Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the past between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. Hello and welcome back to what I think is now our third or maybe fourth show without skipping weeks. And I personally really like this model. I like this frequency, and I would love to keep it up. So be sure to check out patreon.com/mythicmind and lend support if you would like for me to be able to keep this pace. But more on that later. For now, I want to go ahead and move into this week's conversation. I recently spoke with Chris Jackson, who has drafted a book that deals with the ideas of legacy and the hero's journey. Which are definitely important issues for me. I mean, who are we? What's in a name? What is the context in which we lead our lives? And how ought we to see ourselves within the bigger picture of the world around us? As well as, of course, within our families and the lives that they touch. When Chris reached out to me to talk about this, I was really glad to set up this time to talk. And now let's go ahead and get to it. All right, welcome back to Mythic Mind. Today we're going to be talking with Chris Jackson, who is, at this point, he's drafted a book and dealing with legacy and hero's journey and all kinds of stuff that we often talk about. And so, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'd love to begin by having you just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what led you in this direction.
Sure. No, thank you, Andrew. I guess, pre-starting my career, I grew up kind of very much introduced by my parents to the great myths and histories of our time, I guess. So, I grew up very early on with a fascination for Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings, some of the Greek myths. My parents are both very spiritual. My mother's a lay preacher within the Methodist Church. So I have that kind of angle as well. So again, I grew up with a lot of C.S. Lewis, the Narnia stories when I was a kid. And I took a huge amount of inspiration from those. I just found like the magic, the words, the underlying themes just spoke to me, I guess. I loved them. And so, that kind of led, again, my mother's a historian by training. I did a history degree as kind of a result and kind of followed in her footsteps. And when I then got into the corporate world, I guess, and started my career, I came into it with this great sense of, wow, this is going to be amazing. I can really make a mark on the world. And I guess I worked hard, applied myself, rose quickly, rose into leadership roles. But throughout the whole period, both for me and colleagues around me, it wasn't particularly fulfilling. We'd always been brought up with this concept of success and a need to, if you work hard, you'll be really successful, and that will solve all your problems and things. But the further you got into it, the more and more you realize that actually most people who are successful or just even working hard towards success are not very happy. They're fairly miserable. The targets, the life that you're leading is, it doesn't add any value, to be honest, even to the company, quite often, a lot of the time. And so that kind of sparked, I kind of took a step back to my roots, I guess, and started looking at, well, what is it that really motivates people, and what is it that actually speaks to people? And by looking at, or talking to colleagues, by looking at these old inspirations that I'd had, and looking at some of the names through history, you say, well, what is it that actually makes people remembered? And that kind of got me down this path of looking at legacy, and why legacy is really, rather than looking about yourself, it's about looking at other people and making a positive impact on others. Because ultimately, what I realized is nobody cares about your success. Success is inherently selfish. You're just looking about yourself. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it doesn't add any value to anybody else. It makes no impact. It's not particularly fulfilling. And yet the people who we remember, whether it's Socrates through to Gandhi or Martin Luther King, they've really made an impact, and what they do resonates. And you look back at, the the Lord of the Rings and things like that, and why that resonates. And you start to realize that there might be a bit of a common theme there. And it's not necessarily about their success, but it's about what they've done for other people and that impact. And that kind of led me down that path, I guess.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot with my students. Right now I'm teaching a course, kind of intro philosophy religion called Life, Death, and Meaning, which is all about how do you live a life of meaning with the knowledge of the fact that you're going to die, right? That is the fate of all
Yes.
mortals. And so if there's going to be a legitimate answer to that, if we're going to say that life does genuinely have meaning, and I certainly believe that it does, the question has to be, what is able to stand in the face of death? What is the grave not going to wipe out? And whatever's left, I mean, that's where we need to double down. And so it definitely seems like you're moving in that kind of direction. And so you talked about success and how a lot of people I think just don't really ask the question, like, what does it even mean to be successful? And so you kind of already hinted at it with your intro, but how are you defining success, or what what is success? I just ask that as broadly as I can.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because actually, during as I wrote my book, you start to see that success just means whatever you want it to mean. Um, and I ask, when I do mentoring with people, or when I talk about this topic in general, I always ask people, well, in today's society, if you become the CEO of a major business, you're pretty successful, right? And they go, well, yeah, cool. So how many Fortune 500 CEOs can you name? And the answer is almost none. So these people who we kind of aspire to be, they're making no impact on us on a day-to-day basis. And then you can look at, but the ones that they can name, it might be Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Henry Ford, if you go back far enough. You can argue the toss about whether it's a positive legacy they're building, but and again, we can unpack positive and negative legacies shortly if you want to. But the fact is that they've made an impact on our lives because they set out to do something bigger than just make money. And then it's the same. You can look at CEOs and why we can name so few of them, but then I'd also like to give a probably more extreme example. Well, yeah, we all know Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks did a huge amount in terms of her life. You wouldn't necessarily call her successful in the traditional sense of the word. Yet she changed the world by, an action on a bus. I mean, she did more than that, but that's what she's mainly remembered for, I guess, or what she's most famous for. And so success to me means whatever you want it to be. You can wake up and say, yeah, I had a successful day today. I put my clothes on successfully, but it's very personal. It's just what you want it to mean. Whereas I think legacy, by contrast, is something that's lasting, and it relies on other people. Other people have to see value in it and have to want to pass it on. And I think you mentioned it in one of your articles or episodes back in April, I think it was, and Andrew, where you said, for something to endure for so long, it has to have more than simple entertainment value. It has to speak to us on some kind of deep level, and that to me is legacy. Now, it can apply across lots of different areas. If you're looking at it from a business perspective or a humanitarian perspective or a philosophical perspective, but it has to resonate with people, and it has to be something that people kind of feel at a deeper level, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I like how you emphasize the fact that success divorced from legacy really becomes self-referential. You become isolated. And I mean, this is
Yeah.
exactly how C.S. Lewis portrays hell in The Great Divorce, right? It's radical isolation, where even the home in which you live is nothing more than a projection of your own thoughts. It doesn't even keep out the rain. It's just sort of this illusion of security. And that's really what self-referential success only ever is. It's a kind of an illusion of meaning. It might be meaningful to you, but again, then you're still caught up in yourself. You have to have that broader, what impact am I actually making on the world around me? Now, I mean, obviously, we don't see a lot of the impact that our lives have, right?
Mm.
That the majority of our impact is going to happen after we die. That it's just as the things that we do reverberate throughout time moving forward. And so, like, how do we uh, how do we create a positive legacy, or how do we work toward that? Recognizing that like we don't know what the consequences of our lives are really going to be in so many levels. Like how do we keep that in mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think the way that I've chosen to explore it in my book, or the framework that I've given, is this concept of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Um, and I think I've chosen that one because it resonated with me and I could make sense of it. But I think also if you look at a lot of the great stories that we love, whether it's the Lord of the Rings, whether it's Star Wars, Harry Potter, or if you look at something like the Odyssey, Gilgamesh potentially, and then I guess if you look into scripture as well, one of the more famous ones would be Jonah and the whale. But I use that as a framework to say, well, look, these stories really resonate with us. There's something about these stories that really speak to us more deeply. That whether they're a fantasy story like Lord of the Rings, or whether they're a myth, or even if it's a person's life, if you can take that arc, they really resonate. And so why do they resonate? And so I kind of use that, backed up by a number of articles which I cite throughout the book from modern psychology, even that they resonate with us because there's something there that we can and potentially should unpack ourselves and use to inspire us. The Lord of the Rings shouldn't just be inspiring because it's a great story and it speaks to us in that manner. The reason it speaks to us in that manner, to me, is that there is action that we can take through that, and I guess the hero's journey kind of underpins that.
Okay. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people listening are at least vaguely aware of Campbell and the hero's journey, and I admit that I'm only aware through secondary sources. I haven't actually spent a lot of primary time with Campbell. And so, can you just tell us, like, what does he mean when he talks about the hero's journey? Because I know that's important for your book. So, can you just kind of give a summary or to kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And again, I'm no real specialist in Campbell. I've not done any thesis or anything like that. But essentially, Campbell wrote about this idea. His concept was of what he called a monomyth. So it was an idea that resonated if you unpack stories, religious and otherwise, from around the world. A lot of the most famous stories and a lot of the key tenets within them, you could ascribe what he called the hero's journey to them, whereby there was a start of a journey, someone would potentially feel a call to action or adventure, as he put it. They might resist that call. So again, with Jonah, he calls it the belly of the whale, potentially, where Jonah is refusing to do what he's asked and he's kind of swept along anyway, through to what he calls a road of trials. You find a mentor who will help you. So, again, in the Lord of the Rings, it might be Gandalf. In Star Wars, it would be Yoda, who will help you kind of develop as you go, but they can only take you so far. There will be huge obstacles to overcome along the path. And then, there's a major challenge towards the end. There's a moment of transcendence, and then you kind of come back down to earth, I guess, to share the value of what it is that you've learned. And I think, again, you've kind of unpacked this in certain episodes before, but the task is made to be difficult because it's only difficult things that kind of inspire you to really find out who you can be and really push yourselves. And that's kind of where the nobility lies, I suppose.
Yeah, and so that monomyth idea, and it's basically this idea that is the basic framework of nearly any great story, correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so why do you think, like on the psychological level or theological or wherever you want to go with this, like why do you think that is the case? That you can look at all these great myths, even from disconnected cultures, disconnected times and places, and it seems to be the basic structure of myth of a good story. Like, why? How do we account for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think probably it comes down to something that you say a number of times yourself. It's like there's a kind of a central truth about that. People understand that in order to really live a fulfilling life and to really grow as a person and add value and do something heroic, not necessarily in a sword wielding sense, but kind of heroic as in a kind of really valuable, courageous way for society, demands something, demands you stepping out of your comfort zone. And I think there's a real degree of truth within that just resonates with people at a kind of spiritual, emotional level.
Mhm. Yeah, as far as relatively modern psychologists go, I definitely appreciate Jung, who plays a part in some of these conversations, who would say that they're, that basically the myths, the Greek mythologies, even just today modern stories, that they are really the sort of like the waking dreams of the geniuses, right? The people who are able to make these great myths that just as dreams, they don't come from nowhere. They come from something. It's mostly our, unconscious kind of working its way up and trying to make sense of what we understand without understanding it. And that in large part, that's kind of what these great myths are. It's what Homer was doing. And so when he's, spinning out these great myths, he's consciously or unconsciously sort of tapping into something real about the human experience, which is why these great stories of the past endure to today. And we can still look back at them and recognize that there's something genuinely true here. And this isn't something that I really understood until, I mean, relatively recently, last few years. I was not a voracious reader growing up as a child. It really it wasn't until I was nearly finished my doctoral degree that I finally recognized that there's truth in fiction. Like
Yes.
I was so like inundated with this modern idea of, well, fiction is just make believe and nonfiction's true. And that's just a total misunderstanding as to what stories are, what literature is. And so that realization, I just shifted the whole trajectory of my life. And so a lot of what you're saying here, I still consider to be like fresh and exciting. Um, Now, you talk about there are some different pathways to legacy. I mean, obviously, we aren't all going to achieve the same legacy in the same way. And so, what are some of these different routes to legacy or different forms that building a positive legacy, like what can that look like?
Yeah, it's one of the things I talk about before we kind of jump into that is again scale of legacy as well, right? A lot of people kind of, oh, I want to change the world, but you can leave a legacy on your local community. You can leave a legacy on your family, obviously, but you can leave a legacy on your local community rather than having to be national or international in scope. And a lot of the time, it's those small, humble deeds that don't necessarily get noticed, that are far more valuable than the greatest intentions that never get enacted. And so, one thing I would always encourage is, to think about some of the architects of legacy that I kind of we'll talk about in a second, but they don't have to be huge, grand ideas. You can change the life of a person, you can change the life of a group. And I think sometimes people get too caught up on the grandiose and then don't take any action, which is, I think, the biggest failing of all, right?
Yeah, and that's just I think in many ways the grain I'm going to go change the world. It's really just a way to hide from our actual immediate responsibility. Because when we say I'm going to go change the world, well, that's such a grand objective that there's really no specific entry point, and so we don't actually do anything other than maybe rouse up some heroic sentiments and post something on Twitter to feel like we've
Yes.
really accomplished something. But it's a lot harder to actually just take care of your immediate responsibilities in the world around you, which is how we're meant to live, right? We are localized creatures. Despite the illusions that we get through social media and, just the constant connection we have to the world, like we are local creatures. We are not omnipresent. We are not omniscient. And so the path to legacy, I agree. It starts with right where you are, clean your room, put your life together, take care of your
Yeah.
immediate responsibilities.
Well, and anything else then becomes just ego, really. If you set
Right.
out to change the world, that's you, and you want to look good, as opposed to saying, well, actually, there's a need here, there's a need there. And some people will have those grand ideas. I want to land on Mars. I want to create an electric car. Cool, but a lot of the time, those didn't start out as well, bang, I'm going to make a rocket that goes straight to Mars. There's still steps that have to be taken, and if it grows, if it's ripples in a pond and out they spread, superb. But it doesn't have to be that. And I think to answer your initial question, Andrew, that the first step is courage, frankly. So, and I guess to take a step back again, like I'll talk about 4 archetypes. I'm not saying they're the only ones. They were the 4 that I managed to come up with for the book. I'm sure there are people will argue the value of some of them, but some of them will overlap. So I think from my perspective, if you can leave a legacy with a single archetype, but the more attributes you show or you're able to develop, the more likely you are to leave a legacy, in my mind, in some shape, manner, or form. The first one, as I say, is courage. And I think without courage, you're not going to leave a legacy at all. Because the difference with legacy as opposed to success, which is why it's harder to leave and create, I guess, is that it needs to be different. And almost by definition, it takes some courage to be different. And again, whether that's doing something crazy, physically brave on a battlefield, or whether it's just doing something like Rosa Parks and refusing to give up a seat on a bus. All of those things take courage. And I think what resonates with people first and foremost is often courage. It's the courage to do something that other people know is the right thing to do, but they know deep down they wouldn't do themselves. And so if you're unable to live your life with courage, when you get to these difficult, noble ideas or challenges that you have to go through, most people will shy away from them, as Jonah did with the whale. I don't really want to have to do that. You kind of leave it for somebody else. And so I think that anybody who is able to step above that and kind of transcend the mass is already taken a step in the right direction. Does that guarantee legacy? Absolutely not. But I don't think you can leave legacy without courage first.
Now, courage is obviously not easy to come by. I mean, most people today don't want to answer their phone when it rings, especially if it's a number they don't know. And so, I can't speak to all cultures, but definitely in our culture, I think courage is a rare commodity. And so, how do we go about cultivating courage if we're just kind of afraid of the world, right? We're all wound up in anxiety. How do we step out of that and start to cultivate real courage?
Yeah, and it's something that I talk about. I actually spend a chapter trying to unpack it within the book in terms of, how might you do that? And here are some simple things that you can take. And actually, I draw quite heavily on a martial arts instructor who I've been privileged to work with a little bit. I spent a lot of time doing martial arts growing up. And he talks a lot about fear management. There's a guy called Tony Blauer. And he really kind of unpacks it like you need to start small. I mean, there's a whole concept that he talks around, but at a very simple level, he talks about like just indoctrinating yourself slowly on a day-to-day basis. So he even gives the examples of like, you're at a restaurant, you don't really like the meal that you've got. Do you just say, oh yeah, it's lovely and keep eating? Well, actually, no, I'm going to send that back because it's just, you've created a little bit of friction there that a lot of people like to turn away from. I'm British. The Americans are much more comfortable at sending things back than the Brits are. The Brits would eat almost something inedible before they would try and make a fuss. So it's certainly something for me to work on. But little things like that, or if you see something that you don't feel is right at work, politely challenging it back rather than just accepting it for what it is. It's some people are more naturally brave, I would imagine, than others, but it's not something that you can, or that most people can just jump into and go, oh, well, I'm going to do this crazy wild thing. You need to kind of get used to it and build up. It needs to be trained in the same way that most things need to be trained. And that to me has been very useful. And realizing when you're scared and what to do about it. Again, you're going to find situations where, oh, I wish I'd done that differently. I got scared. Fine, be aware of it, move on, and try again. Coming on this podcast to a degree is slightly nerve-wracking because it's something I'm talking about my book for the first time with somebody who is talking about it and critiquing it. And so you have an ego that says, well, I want this to be good, I want this to be good. So start small and just push a little bit outside of your comfort zone, and that's where you'll start to find the growth. And most of the time you find out that it's not as bad as you think it's going to be. Blauer also talks quite a lot about the concept of fear as an acronym: false expectations appearing real. A lot of the time you get an idea in your head about how something is going to turn out, and usually it doesn't turn out like that. And there's a big distinction between danger, which is very real, and fear, which is largely psychological. And realizing that when you push yourself outside of your comfort zone, most of the time it wasn't as bad as you think, will allow you to kind of get some growth and start you in the right direction in a slightly easier manner, I guess.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, you're basically treating your general fear as a lot of times how phobias get treated, right? It's through
Yes.
incremental exposure. And so you start to get more comfortable with yourself in new environments and just kind of work your way out from there incrementally. And also, I mean, I think that this is where myths and stories can come into view, whether you're reading nonfiction or fiction. Like read about heroic things that set your gaze
Yes.
on courage. And then you'll see that reflected back into your own life. I mean, in my life, death, and meaning class, in addition to have them reading some classical philosophy, I also have them read stories like Beowulf,
Mm.
which in that story, like you have this hero who doesn't spend a lot of time asking himself like how he feels about doing things. It's just there's a need, he jumps in, and he does it.
Mm.
And I think that looking at that kind of heroism, and then just sort of um, almost I think if you're enmeshing a good story, that's going to become to some level part of who you are, where you're so used to looking at what heroism looks like, then eventually you recognize that you are becoming something like what you're seeing, what you're being involved in. And
Well,
so yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say that goes back to what you were saying earlier, where myths are often more real
Mhm.
than science, because it creates that role model, and it doesn't matter whether that person was real or not. Or if you look at something from history as a legend, it doesn't matter whether they did it or not. It's inspiring to you as an individual, and it's like, well, I want to be more like that person. Um, yeah, so I totally agree with you. Yeah, and I think it's that to me was the magic of something like Lord of the Rings. I wanted to be Aragorn when I grew up,
Of
essentially. And it's like, oh,
course.
well, that's someone who I want to be. And now you kind of look and go, well, actually, maybe Frodo was the better person to want to be. But it's interesting. But as you say, you take that inspiration, and that to me is where myths can be, and stories in general can be so much more valuable than reality, because reality, particularly if you had like the modern way of looking at it, which is often very scientific, and you go, well, it wouldn't be like that or whatever. You're right, but it removes all of the magic, the romance. Like there's no inspiration or emotion there. It's these stories that really spark that.
Yeah, and the reality is that anything we meaningfully call reality ultimately is it's a narrative. It's a stringing together of facts and data, even in the scientific realm, that we're stringing together these ideas and we're imbuing these different ideas with meaning, with a narrative structure. And so narratives are real. This is why I like how C.S. Lewis talks about the value of myth in that the what's true in a myth is eternally true, as
Mm,
opposed to the myths of particular things that we experience in the day-to-day world given over to change. And so, when we look to what is eternally true, that then gives some grounding to the particular truths that we encounter on a primary world level. And I think that, I mean, I don't know how, abstract and philosophical we need to get with this, but I think that we need more being to anchor our becoming, and having that kind of rest in unending realities, like recognizing there is something like goodness. I think that that
mm,
is what gives us confidence. Recognizing that even the word confidence, confide, with faith, right? It's this idea that we are able to rest in something that is stronger than ourselves, and in so doing, we gain more strength. In other words, like we're not living for ourselves, which again brings us back into that legacy model of we're not just looking for personal success, but we're contextualizing ourselves within a bigger reality. And in so doing, we ourselves become bigger. Um, and I don't have a conclusion to that monologue, but
but no, I completely agree with you. It's if you if you only focus on yourself, you can't really grow. And if you're really looking at, as you say, that foundation, it goes all the way back. Like there's that one single strand of truth. Everybody resonate or understands the concept of those stories, and we're in a very, very different society now than we were 2,000, 4,000 years ago, and yet there are stories that still persist all the way through, or that we've essentially rewritten into another story with this kind of hero's journey concept that just speak to people, and they would have spoken to people 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, just as they would do today. And as you say, it's that single truth, and there's that understanding that there's a single truth, there's a single goodness that kind of runs through this that people just inherently understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's evident to anybody who's been engaged with minds of the past that human nature fundamentally has not changed, right? Culture
Yeah, agree.
changes, technology changes, but people are people anywhere, anytime. And that's why, as you said, these stories from thousands of years ago still resonate today. And even when people haven't read some of these ancient myths, they've encountered them without recognizing it in the various ways they've been appropriated throughout our culture. They have enduring value because, well, again, I think that they speak to eternal realities. Um, Now, obviously, not all legacies are good. um,
No.
so yeah, I mean, you talk a little bit here about the dark side of legacy. I mean, what do you mean by that, and how do we end up in that place?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. I wanted to call it out because, as you go through, or as I went through my writing process, you're always aware that, well, you want to write this as from a positive perspective, and that there are, I think there are archetypes that underpin why people get remembered, but there are just as many people who get remembered for terrible things. And how do you therefore account for that? Hitler, for example, would be a fairly obvious one, but you can kind of take your pick throughout history. And I think, again, it's the counterpoint to the good, in my perspective. So, you remember Hitler because we know we know what good is, and therefore, by definition, you know what evil is. And therefore, Hitler becomes that cautionary tale of, well, this is what happens if good people don't act. You end up with evil. And so I think for each of the archetypes that I look through, I mean, Hitler was probably brave. I mean, he did some things. It took some kind of warped courage to go through what he did, but there's a very bad flip side to that, and I wanted to call that out because, again, it's very easy, I think, to just say, well, I want to leave a legacy. It's like, yeah, but at what price? Do you want to leave any legacy, or do you want to leave a specific legacy that's positive, that resonates? Because, again, Hitler will always resonate, but as a cautionary tale about what not to do, in the starkest possible sense. So I think there will always be that flip side. If there's good, there's evil.
Now, surely Hitler, I mean, we all agree he was an evil man, did evil things. But that being said, surely he didn't see himself as such. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So how do we guard against that? And, how do we know that whatever it is that we see as the positive legacy we ought to lead, that's not going to be, condemned in, a couple hundred years? Like, how do we actually know what we're doing is good?
Well, and it's even that last question, Andrew, is interesting, right? Because legacy changes through time. You look at Winston Churchill, and at the time, I think it was probably when we hit the year 2000, and they were doing all kinds of stuff like across the last century, and I think Winston Churchill was voted the greatest ever Briton at that point. Now you look at it, and people are saying, "Oh, yeah, but he was a misogynist, he was an alcoholic, he was quite possibly racist." So legacy is going to change over time, which does make it tricky because you can only act within your time based on the reality that you live in at that point. People will change their own reality as you go. But for someone, I mean, Hitler's an extreme example because I think you would probably
Sure.
end up saying that there are psychological issues at play there, and things too that, that need to get tracked. But if you bring it back to a more slightly more manageable level, I guess. I think it's making sure that you don't get divorced from reality and staying in touch, listening to what other people are saying in the widest sense, not just a little clique of people around you, but actually paying attention to that. So there's there's an interesting example I gave in the book. Might even be in the first chapter where I talk about Alfred Nobel. And Nobel is obviously known really today for his work with the various Nobel prizes that he does, not least the Peace Prize. But he became incredibly successful and incredibly rich during his lifestyle, designing weapons. Essentially, he was doing developing various forms of dynamite and explosives. And in his mind, he was building a positive legacy because the weapons that he was creating were so terrible that nobody in their right mind would ever want to use them. It was his argument, and that was how he kind of, tricked himself, I guess, talking about the road to good intentions. But it was only when he read an article in a newspaper where his brother had died. And his brother was pretty well known at the time as well and very successful in his own right. But the journalist who wrote the article obviously confused the two of them and led with the headline, the Merchant of Death is dead. And it was so essentially, Alfred Nobel ended up reading his own obituary while he was still alive and suddenly realizing, well, is this actually how people view me? And then basically he spent the whole of his life being successful, or he spent the vast majority of his life being successful. Then he had this epiphany when he read the article and spent the rest of his life trying to undo the success he'd built and completely change his legacy, which I guess to a greater or lesser extent he managed to do. So again, I think it's keeping your head up and not just focusing on yourself throughout this. There's always a danger, right, when you're trying to do good for other people and you're trying to that the ego takes over, and that it becomes about, well, are you actually doing this for other people, or are you doing this for yourself? You just kind of want to look good, and it sounds cool. And so being able to take those steps where you can stay plugged into society in such a way that you can accept criticism and say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to listen to all criticism because you don't want to be a pleaser, but finding that balance where, if you're finding enough feedback that you have to be able to process that and consider that you may not be right, and that you may need to change direction. And I think something that I try and unpack at a certain stage later on in the hero's journey, where you've done all the difficult stuff, as it were. You've fought the bad guys, you've been triumphant, you've succeeded against the odds, and then you've made it to the other side. But there's a huge temptation at that point. So, oh yeah, I've done it, and I'm gonna cash in on that, and I'm gonna take the fame, I'm gonna take the glory, I'm gonna take the girl, rather than continue that journey and make sure that it's, I'm now imparting what I've learned to other people, and actually finishing the journey, as opposed to just getting distracted by the beautiful trappings that go with earning the treasure. If you can find the treasure, but you've got to take it back to other people to share. Otherwise, you might leave a legacy, but you've stopped. You've not really, your legacy's open to interpretation there. And you see that, I think, quite a lot. You'll see people like Henry Ford is one. As an automotive person, he left an incredible legacy, but there are certainly large parts of his legacy that you might look at and say, well, they were quite dark. You don't have to look very far to find out some of the things that some of his opinions on race, for example. And so it's about maintaining yourself as a rounded human being, rather than just focusing on, well, this was the one strand that I wanted to unpick, and that's all I'm focusing on, because I think you can become self-obsessed at that point.
Yeah, and to speak to part of that hero's journey you're just laying out about bring the victory back home. I mean, you've talked about Lord of the Rings a good bit. I mean, this is why we've got the Scouring of the Shire is the end of the book. It's we need to bring the battle back home. We need to cleanse the evil in outside our own front door. And so it's not just we need to go destroy the ring, but we need to undo the effects of the lust of power back home. It's not until you go back home is the journey over. And even then, it's not really over because at that point, you have to at the very least maintain that victory or more likely go out and start winning the next whatever you have to do. Now, as part of this, not getting lost in your own intentions, you talk about the importance of having a mentor. Um, Practically speaking, I mean, how do you go about finding a mentor and what should that relationship even look like?
Hmm. It's an interesting one because I think people have a certain idea about what a mentor should be. Um, and I try and simplify it in the book as far as I can by talking about, look, almost anything or anyone can be a mentor. You can go to your library and pick up an inspirational book. You can read Lord of the Rings and to a degree go, well, if I want to be more like Aragorn, how do I go about doing that? That's only going to take you so far, and so I think you do need people in your lives. But again, there are lots of different ways to do it. You can listen to podcasts. You don't have to spend a huge amount of money on actual formal structure that I check in once a week and they give me work to do. I've been lucky enough to have mentors through my life, whether it was my parents and my family, obviously my wife. So you can certainly use them for advice. And again, if you look at people like Rosa Parks, I think she would say that she lent very heavily on her husband for support and advice. Not that she was beholden to him, but it was, having someone you can use as a sounding board. It could be a good friend. It could be an acquaintance who you trust. It could be someone at work. Yes, it could be a paid mentor, but it could just as easily be a martial arts coach or a sports coach, or whoever. I don't think you have to overcomplicate it. Those people are out there if you want to pay for them, but starting out, they tend to. I don't think you have to just sit there and wait for Yoda. That's not realistically going to happen. I think this concept of the when the student is ready, the mentor will appear. Takes some action from you, but if you go out looking for a mentor, you will find a mentor, and you just have to be open to what that person may look like. At the same time, I think in reality, there's no harm in having multiple mentors. You might have a mentor to help you with fear management, for example, and you might have a mentor to help you with public speaking, and not the fear side of public speaking, but becoming more polished. So that there are different ways to look at it, but I think if you're open-minded and if you know at the start what you feel called to do and you feel that you want to set out on that adventure, you will find the right person for you. And it's why I think you get the call to adventure, then you get the refusal of the call, and then the mentor comes after that, because you realize that actually you can't do it on your own, and you become a bit more open-minded to, well, okay, who might be the people around me in my life who I could seek out and have help me.
Yeah, it seems like it really just comes down to humility, which you will necessarily have if you're pursuing something beyond yourself, because, well, that requires a humble disposition.
Mm,
And, if you're recognizing that, you are serving something beyond yourself, something bigger than yourself, then, well, you're going to want to seek out the best way of doing that. And naturally, that leads to looking for wisdom from those who know more than you, at least on some aspect of the journey. And so, I think this is another area, probably like a lot of these things we're discussing, where people tend to overcomplicate the process, where they think to have a mentor is to like have that Yoda figure, like some kind of,
yes.
devoted, like, I need some sage to tell me what to do. It's really just you asking the question, how do I find out what I need to know in order to do this thing?
Exactly that. And I think, as you say, people are waiting for someone to open the door and go, come with me, we're going on a starship, or I'm taking you on a crazy adventure, here's a sword. It doesn't really work like that. It's a motif. It's not, that's where you have to bring the myth into reality, I guess.
Now, as you start to move on this path, you gain more confidence. You talk about the temptation to become overly confident in what you're doing in your hero's journey. I mean, how do you guard against that? Because it's easy to do when things seem to be going well. It seems like your actions are bearing the kind of fruit you're looking for. Lady Fortune spinning her wheel in your direction. It feels like you are really doing it. How do you maintain humility and shirk away from that temptation?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say if look, obviously you expect to make some progress, right? But if it's too easy and you never encounter any hardship, you're not doing it the right way. You read any of these stories, Beowulf, as you say, or Lord of the Rings, whatever it might be. The hero never just turns up and wins. Just here we go. So if you're going in that direction, you're heading in the wrong direction, as far as I'm concerned. You might need to reconsider who your mentor is, because you need to find a mentor who's prepared to speak truth to you, not just tell you what you want to hear. There needs to be development within that, and therefore, if you're not struggling, you're either heading in the wrong direction or you're not really trying very hard. You're just kind of kidding yourself. And that's why, if you look around, it's very easy. If I take my own examples, you can write a book. I felt called to write a book. I'm going to write a book about legacy. I've written a book about legacy. Well, that was easier than I expected. I mean, it took me a long time and I had to think about it, but I finished the book. It wasn't crazy challenging, but you haven't shown it to anybody. You're using you're hiding behind your fears to feel that you've achieved something. You've just taken one step of a considerably longer journey. And so I think either you're heading in the wrong direction, or you're not really, you're hiding behind something, and you're kidding yourself that you're growing. And you might, probably grew a little bit writing a book, but it's when you start putting it out there and asking for criticism and yeah, even asking for attention, and people go, I'm not really very interested. That's where the challenge really starts to kick in. And that's why, you often see one of the motifs with the hero's journey is the betrayal of a friend or something like that, because it's often the people closest to you who you think are going to be really appreciative and really going to give you that lift, who say, I don't find that very interesting, or I don't find that very inspiring, or I'm just not interested. And you see it time and time again in business. You'll see people, generally speaking, you'll set up a business and you think all your friends have been really supportive, and you say, cool, let's come and buy something off me. And nobody really does. And it will be people who you weren't expecting to get support from, who will suddenly come out of the woodwork. And so I think that would be my advice there is, look, are you really growing? Or again, have you hidden behind your fears, or are you heading in the wrong direction?
So the other side of that question, how do you guard against the temptation to despair when it seems like things just aren't working out?
Well, and that's why I kind of draw on the concept of the hero's journey, because the idea there is that if you can take a step back at those points and reframe your life, or this phase, as rather than, well, I'm just losing, I should just give up and despair, drawing on this story and go, well, actually, no, this is like X in Lord of the Rings, for example. This is what was happening, and just no, this is part of the process. Like, you have to accept that when things get really difficult, that's meant to happen. It's part of the growth cycle. It's part of that. Anybody can be brave when there's nothing to be brave about. Anybody can live nobly when you're not challenged to do anything different. You can. It's only when you find things are difficult that you really find out, do you really believe in this? Is this actually the journey I want to go on, or not? And I think if you can reframe it of like, well, yeah, it's supposed to be difficult. That's kind of part and parcel of growth and the journey that I'm supposed to go on. And if it's not difficult, then it's not really very heroic. And if you can reframe it, and that person say, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be, this is what's supposed to happen, at least you're pre-prepared for that, and you can kind of accept that you're on the right path because it got difficult.
Yeah, I often go back to Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, in which he says that for the good man, for somebody who is centered in goodness, all fortune is good fortune.
Mm-hmm.
Because if fortune seems to be spinning in your direction, everything's going well on a circumstantial level, then you can hold that with an open hand, recognizing that no particular state of events around you is stable because we live in a moving world. Things change. So many things are simply outside of our control. It doesn't matter how well you take care of your body, you exercise, you eat well, you can still get hit by a car. Like
Exactly. Yeah.
so, and so when things are going well, we hold that with an open hand and we can use those resources to do good things. But when things aren't going well for us on a fortune level, well, that's still good fortune because now we can still just double down on the things that don't change. We can become more grounded in what is good, become more grounded in what is enduring, and in so doing, gain more strength for the hero's journey in whatever form that
Exactly.
looks like. And I think that what our heroism, what our legacy is, I mean, our vision of that very well could change over time. And if it doesn't, then we're probably not being authentic.
Yes.
Because, as you said, our vision for how things are going to play out very often is not how things play out. And maybe that's because, well, we need to just keep going and learn how to overcome the obstacle, or maybe our vision wasn't right to begin with, and maybe we need to amend that as well.
Yeah.
And so,
There's a
yeah,
great quote by I think it might be Douglas Adams where he says, um, I didn't arrive at where I intended to, but I think I arrived at where I was meant to, or something like that. And as you say, a lot of it is just setting out. You don't know where it's going to lead, but if you feel that, no, I want to make a positive impact on other people, see where that takes you. It doesn't really matter where you end up by the end of that journey. You may or may not leave a legacy. And I kind of jumping the gun a little bit here, but that's ultimately my conclusion is you set out with the concept of making a great difference and living for other people. Doesn't really matter where it takes you. You'll find challenges all the way along the way. People are going to try and tear you down. People are going to tell you that you're living for yourself. All of these things, some of them are going to help shape you, some of them are going to help redirect you, some of them are going to help you grow. At the end of it, whether you leave a legacy or not, and whether you're remembered in 100 years is kind of by the by. If you've lived positively for other people, it will be more fulfilling, both for you and for society. And it was a worthy trip to start out on, whatever happens at the end of it.
yeah, fair enough. And I think that if we're looking to just be remembered, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're not guaranteed any of that. But what
No,
we are guaranteed is that we have present responsibilities, and the better we execute them, the more impact that we're going to have that's going to reverberate, into however many years are left and ultimately into eternity. Like our actions have so many consequences that we simply can't perceive. But when we perceive what we can, set our vision appropriately, then the journey kind of lays itself out to the extent that we're responsible for taking it. I mean, even in Lord of the Rings, right? That Frodo, it was never providentially his task actually to destroy the ring.
yes.
He was supposed to just take it as far as he could take it, and that was it. Um, well, is there anything else that we have not discussed that you feel like we should discuss?
Um, I don't think so. No, I mean, I could talk about this topic for hours, as you'd probably guess, but no, I think this has been a very good kind of overview. And as I say, I think that the key point to remember is really if you have the courage to start and you have the courage to live in a different way to the way most people will live because they don't live with that courage, and you let yourself see where it goes. Ultimately, legacy is a great reason to set out, but at the end of the day, is you know, when you come to breathe your last breath, does legacy really matter? I mean, it might matter to other people, but it was the reason you left. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter. There's a great quote. In fact, I've got the end of the poem, because I was looking at it earlier, which I think sums it up beautifully. I don't know if you've come across the poem Ithaca. And the but the it talks about Odysseus essentially, but the end of the poem says, arriving there is what you're destined for, but don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so you're old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you've gained along the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you have become, so full of experience, you'll have understood then what these Ithacas mean. And that, to me, is what you're trying to achieve in legacy, in life, and that's the way to lead a good life as far as I'm concerned.
Well said. I think it's a great way to wrap it up. I feel like this was a good general conversation about legacy and the various things that you've been writing about. And maybe at some point in the future, we can dig into maybe some particular example you talk about and kind of dissect that in a more particular form. But for now, good conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
No, likewise. Thank you so much for having me, and best of luck with the rest of the show. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed that, and be sure to keep up with Chris at his website, alegacylived.com, and you can find that link in the show notes. And if you've recently written or otherwise made something that you would like to discuss on the show, maybe you even have a podcast of your own, well, let me know. The odds are that if you are someone who listens to the show, it would be a good fit here, most likely. And so if you want to set something up, then send me an email at mythicmindpodcast@gmail.com. And now, as a reminder, I've made all content from the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course available for Tier 2 patrons and higher, and that's $10 a month. And once we hit the goal of another 10 patrons at that level, I'll start releasing content from the Beowulf and Boethius course at that level as well. And until the end of November, I've also maxed out the discount for annual subscriptions at 16%. And I just found out that you can also gift patronages now, which is pretty cool. And so, if you know someone who would appreciate the Lewis material, as well as the rest of what I have to offer, then I would really appreciate your consideration on this front, that you can not only buy a yearly subscription for yourself at 16% off right now, but you could also buy one for somebody else. And so just keep that in mind. Although by the time this releases in the public feed, you don't have long before November is over. But of course, even after November, you can still do so with just a slightly lower annual discount. Now, I would like to thank all of my Tier 2 patrons and higher by name. And so many thanks to Mark, Cliff, Aaron with an E, Paul, William, Aaron S., Andrew G., Andrew M., Arturo, Brandon, Christopher, Emmy, Ian, Jeremiah, Jocelyn, Josh T., Joshua B., Landon, Matthew, Sarah, and Steele. And of course, thank you to all of my Tier 1 patrons as well. I really would like to keep up this pace of making shows on a weekly basis, as well as I would like the ability to launch off in some other areas as well, but I can only do that with your support. And so if you are not already a patron, well, it's time to come aboard. And if you are, I thank you for what you do already, and I ask that you might consider going up a tier, because you obviously see some value in what we're doing here, and so surely you would like to see even more value come through, and your subscriptions help me to do that. But again, I genuinely do appreciate where you are right now. Now, before we go, I have a couple of book recommendations for you. I've been reading pretty extensively in preparation for the upcoming Lord of the Rings course, and I would like to plug The Philosophy of Tolkien by Peter Kraft and The Flame Imperishable by Jonathan McIntosh. Now, The Philosophy of Tolkien is great if you've not studied philosophy extensively. It's pretty intro level when it comes to philosophy, or if you just want to get jazzed up again about how awesome Tolkien is, how good he is. Not just that he's good at writing, although he is that, but his writing itself is actually good. And Kraft does a great job of demonstrating that. And so regardless of your level of philosophical study, this is just a great book. Now, if you want to take a deeper dive into Tolkien's philosophy, and particularly regarding his metaphysics, then you should check out The Flame Imperishable, in which Jonathan demonstrates the metaphysics of Tolkien's universe, particularly drawing on his creation account in the Ainulindale to connect Tolkien's thought with that of Thomas Aquinas. This is definitely a more dense text than the Kraft text, but that's going to be a good thing for many of you. And so none of you would really go wrong with either option here. You could buy one or the other, or ideally both. They're both definitely worth your time. All right, well, that's it for now. And so until next time, Godspeed. The Mythic Mind Fellowship presents a new study led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, The Wisdom of Middle-earth, the Lord of the Rings. This will be the first study in the Wisdom of Middle-earth series, which seeks to bring an array of companions together with a common desire of growing in wisdom while enjoying the heartening tales of the great tale weaver, J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a profound tale that has literally changed lives, as it has for mine. And what is it that makes this story so powerful and so compelling? It is because Tolkien's stories are fundamentally true, and those who engage with it know exactly what I mean. They speak to the way that things are. As Peter Kreeft said in The Philosophy of Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings is infused with the same light that illumined the man who wrote it, and that light is true, for it reveals the reality of the world and life. So join us on this adventure. Let us grow in wisdom together through immersion in this tale, not through cheap allegorizing, but by getting a better understanding of the ideas and the movements of the heart that bring a tale such as this to life. This 12-week study will begin with Tolkien's creation account, the Ainulindale, and then move to the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Each week will include assigned reading from the Lord of the Rings, a short side lesson at the beginning of the week that addresses a relevant theme, background story, or secondary text. And then, once you've had some time to do the reading, there will be a longer video that serves as a guide in these forests of wisdom. Also, we will have additional recommended readings, an active Discord channel, and weekly live meetings, which will be recorded in case you cannot attend. Whether you are reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time or the 111st time, I invite you to join our company. Prices are currently as low as they ever have been, and they are as low as they ever will be, so go ahead and join today at andrewsnyder.podia.com. And I hope to see you on this road that goes ever on.